Hey, Luke,
Hey, Jump.
what's going on? Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Not too much.
You have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, just a small one. I got my mom and sister over, just here with the wife and the two kids.
Oh, that's great.
And no, this was the first time that we really just tried to cook everything from scratch. I think we got lazy a bit last year and the year before that, and probably every previous year. My mom really likes Wegmans. I don't know if you've heard of Wegmans,
Mhm.
but she really likes them and wanted to like order catering basically. But my sister objected last year and was like, "No, we got to do a real one."
You got to make
So
it.
yeah, so I stuffed, I was stuffing butter in between the skin and the meat of a turkey for the first time in my life.
Whoa.
Um,
I was not even aware these things
I
occurred.
know it's like YouTube. I found like a 7-year-old video from uh, what's his face, that British chef, Gordon Ramsay,
Oh,
posted that thing up. But I had to make a delicious. It was a Christmas bird, but I repurposed it for Thanksgiving, and it was a
nice.
success. A little dry. I overdid it. Um,
Hopefully not like Clark Griswold's turkey, but
no, but would you you went back home to PA?
yeah, saw some family there. Um, Ate a
Nice.
lot and took a nap on the couch
We
after.
got
Good time.
yeah. Call out to Priscilla. Was that it?
That's
I,
it.
I thought that was our first subscriber that we'd never heard of. Turns out it was a family member of yours.
Well, I mean, you never heard of her, so that
Yeah,
that
right.
counts as
First,
something.
that's true. Hello. So yeah, shout out.
Priscilla, if
Um,
you're watching, thanks for subscribing.
that's right. Thanks for subscribing, everyone. Um, so what do we got today,
All
Joe?
right, so yeah, we
What do you want
were
to talk about?
thinking about talking about tariffs this week. Tariffs have been in the news a lot lately, a lot motivated by Trump, of course, a lot during his last term. That was a big part of his overall trade policy, carried over to the past 4 years, and really never really went away per se. And now that Trump was reelected, that rhetoric is really ramping up quite a bit again. So I thought it'd be fun to just talk about tariffs in a very basic sense, kind of contextualize where we're at today, where we've been in the past couple of years, maybe even a little further back in history, and what that might mean going forward. So, tariffs, what are they good for? So, like I was starting to say, definitely in the news again recently. Donald Trump has been furiously working his thumbs on his social network, threatening tariffs, really playing a pretty hands-on policy role before he's even in office here. So this is a collection of a few of his posts over the past couple of weeks, but just very basic background. Ahead of his first term here, he first announced that there's going to be additional tariffs of 60% across the board from Chinese imports, and I believe 20% everywhere else. Since then, and only a couple of weeks since that point, he's been coming out with the basically ratcheting that up a little bit. So targeting people, kind of threatening these things in very specific ways. So just on screen here, this top left is threatening Mexico and Canada for 25% tariffs on all products. Upper right, China, an additional 10% on what he had already mentioned of the 60% already. And then this one at the bottom is a little funny as well. This is more kind of threatening against the creation of a new common currency, which I'm not sure how much it's that really has been described or talked about recently. But he said if that were to happen, you're going to face 100% tariffs. So this is definitely in the news. And we wanted to do a quick back and forth on just kind of outlining some of the cases, both for and against tariffs. I'll take a few minutes and outline just a couple of points on why tariffs might not be such a great idea. And then, Luke, I'll pass it off to you, and we can talk about why they could be a good idea. So the case against tariffs. So in general, if you were to open up any kind of intro econ textbook, tariffs are outlined in some of these simple models as generally just being inefficient. So just to oversimplify things, in opposition to the free market deciding where capital goes, if the government is having a hand in that, that's generally thought about as an inefficient use of capital. And so there's examples of this happening in the past with negative consequences. So in the US in particular, one of the biggest examples is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Basically, this was put into place at the onset of the Great Depression with the overall intent of protecting American workers. It began with just American farmers, I believe, and then it expanded to different industries. And on net, the output was pretty negative for the country overall. So I've got a clip here, a screenshot of a paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. They did this study in the 90s, this comprehensive price study look back on the overall effects of this policy. So on this quick screen cap here, not to go into all the details, but going through this report, and it more or less outlines a lot of ways in which this policy was ultimately harmful to the American people. One of the broadest ways of looking at that is on this chart on the right, more or less showing that, kind of demonstrating that these import volumes tracked gross national product pretty closely. Tariffs naturally reduced import volumes, so they drew, this is one of multiple relationships that they drew there. A similar argument that's made is that just in general, tariffs, they're going to be ineffective overall because that increased costs that's incurred by the importers, it's just going to be ultimately passed on to the consumer in the end. So if an importer has to suddenly pay an additional tax on the goods that they're selling to the U.S., the person or the entity importing the goods are either going to take on that cost themselves. And then if they do that, ultimately that increased cost could be reflected in higher prices for everyday consumers. That said, once you have prices starting to rise, that leads into another point, is that it's generally bad for the economic outlook whenever you start talking about things that would reduce free trade. And again, under the assumption that free trade is the quote unquote best way of allocating capital because the free market knows best, et cetera, et cetera. So what I've got here is there's a memo that was recently declassified by the Fed just recently this year. This was from an earlier meeting in 2018, whenever the first round of tariffs were really getting going over Trump's first term. And basically, they went through and in this document listed out multiple different ways in which this would be harmful to the U.S. economy, from growth declining, from inflation increasing, the stock market would have a negative outlook, and all of these things together in many ways could lead to rising unemployment rates. So the Fed said directly in this, they said that we find that the increase in trade policy uncertainty could reduce the level of aggregate investment by around 1% to 2%, which would imply a fairly small drag of up to 0.25% of the overall U.S. GDP. However, the plausible range around this estimate is wide, encompassing both zero as well as significantly larger effects. And on the left in this graph, just showing some index for how much trade uncertainty was increasing at that time. Trump has recently defended tariffs by pointing back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, saying back then, most of the federal income was funded by tariffs, and kind of with the implication saying, well, why don't we just do that again? The other thing to note today, why tariffs might not be such a great idea, is that back then, indeed, tariffs made up roughly half of all government revenues. Today, the government is far larger, and tariffs only make up about 2% of the overall. So any kind of material increase to government revenue, or, and therefore a reduction in the deficit, really would be small to really not noticeable at all. So the last point I'll raise as to why tariffs are not such a good idea today is that trade wars have real negative outcomes. Whenever one country increases their duties onto another, that other country is likely going to retaliate. If all of these things do result in this negative economic growth and all of these negative effects, this back and forth and retaliatory tariffs, the net effect is that people are going to lose jobs. People's lives are going to be impacted, arguably for something that didn't even need to be done in the first place, i.e., the imposition of these tariffs.
Yeah, when I was sort of looking into this a little bit, sort of you would, um, the whole idea of the trade war, inciting the trade war, and certainly the coverage that Trump has received has been largely negative, I think, from the press, which, like me, I personally have a similar reaction to talking about tariffs in that I'm just kind of against it. I would say my own personal biases are, uh, for a more free market and sort of lowering of tariffs. Um, but what troubled me though is I've got a little bit of a background in China. I lived there for about 4 years. Kind of learned the language. I studied market research. I didn't study, but I worked in market research at the time, and I just know that there are Chinese. They have tariffs on most of the products across the board. So it always annoyed me whenever I would, try to find or research this. Everything that they were talking about, what Trump was doing, was always in the context of inciting a trade war. When I kind of look at it and say, well, the Chinese are already operating on a higher tariff, just like across the board. And, you could arguably say that they already started one and we never retaliated. And now what they're doing, the Chinese are potentially taking this chance to, oh, you're going to raise it. Well, we're going to raise it even higher. And, so I actually, this annoyed me to the point where when I type into Google, Chinese tariffs, how much are Chinese, what are the tariffs that Chinese have imposed when they import goods? No matter how I seem to phrase it in Google, it kept giving me the same answer, and that was the context of this. U.S. is inciting a trade war on the Chinese tariffs. So I just went straight to the WTO, and I was wondering if they had stuff. And yeah, I did find some things. So these are there are official numbers out there. Let me see if I can. You can give you some. We'll put a link of this in the description. But you can look across and just see kind of tariffs by import, by product group. You can see agricultural products, and they break it out by non-agricultural products. So for China, we are looking at, your eye can just kind of scan down the list of these different products, and you're looking at 14, 12, 15, 24, 27. I can share my screen if you want. So this is China. This is something that I pulled off of the WTO. And kind of this first frequency distribution thing that I found, I thought was kind of interesting. You got to stare at it a little bit, but what they're saying is these tariff lines are by import values in percentages. So this whole line, just kind of looking at it, looks, going to sum up to 100%. So the final inbound, and then it's this frequency distribution. So they'll say what percent of the total has had a tariff on it in the range of 5 to 10%. And that answer is 26. What percent of the import value has in tariff applied to it between 10 and 15%, right? 15, 25%. So you can see that the numbers are sort of clustered around, the 10 to 15% number.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you pull up the US number, so that's what this thing is, US, much of their numbers is focused around either duty free or 0 to 5%.
Oh yeah, wow.
It's really not a contest, and this is something
Not
that
at all.
I've always been aware of. So, when Trump says, we're going to put out all these tariffs, and we're going to, levy them across Chinese imports, and then everyone is up in arms talking about free trade, including the Chinese. I think at some point when I don't remember what it was, but it was sometime during the Trump presidency, you got these Chinese in this funny context to me, who has lived there, saying like they're suddenly the champion of free trade. And it's a joke for anyone who's like in the industry, because like they obviously have the highest tariffs, across the board, including, they don't even let some companies into the country at all. But that's sort of for other considerations. But again, my bias is against, my personal bias has to do with, I think we should all lower free trade. But at some point, right, that value of saying, okay, free capital exchange across different borders, it runs into another problem, which is my own sense of like reciprocity, which is another big argument that's being levied. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, well, heck, they're doing it. Let's do it too.
Do you know what time period those numbers that you brought up went over? Like did China have these larger tariffs
this was,
up, for many years, just continuously? And
oh, there it is. Okay, yeah. So it looks like 2022, 2023. And then you can just kind of eyeball the actual tariff by the product. You're just looking at, they're in the teens and the 20s. But then you go to the US and they're, down 1.5. Dairy looks kind of high. So but like, let's at least
very low, like especially like towards the bottom of the page, this like larger equipment, energy is very low.
Yeah,
it's just in general across the board. That's a very stark difference.
It's a big stark difference, and people need to keep this in mind when they kind of start the conversation, I think, between the China and US quote unquote trade war.
Especially whenever it's contextualized, saying that, oh, the US is being provocative or inciting a trade war.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share with you sort of the line that I went down. This is kind of, I just typed into like US trade or whatever, and it kind of lands on something like this. And the first thing it talks about, they give you this infographic, and the infographic, what I thought would be, what I was looking for was going to be, how high are US tariffs on Chinese goods on average, and how high are Chinese tariffs on US goods on average. But instead you get something like this, which, points to something like, on this date, there was like the first list of stuff that they tariffed. And then on this date, there was a retaliation. Wow. And then on this date, there was another one, and it was retaliation. That the focus from all the links that I found on Google was in the context of a trade war that escalated. And I could not find something that just gave the color that I just provided, until I just was like, okay, screw this. And I just typed in, WTO trade statistics, hoping to find something there. Because I didn't have this offhand. I don't look at this stuff every day, but I did, I did work here. I did work in this space. So, not to dive too much in like how this stuff is covered, or like search engine optimization or whatever. I don't know how to search Google, whatever. That was just, I found it a little frustrating.
But in general, yeah, I mean, that's really helpful context for why tariffs might be a good idea.
Yeah. There's a couple things going on, I think. First off, you could try to sell this as like, look, whatever tariff they have, we're just going to get this to zero, basically. What I mean by that is wherever they stick their tariff, we're going to put ours, just 1-to-1. And like, you try to sell that. Maybe that's one approach. Then everyone will be up in arms, and you can just point across the ocean and say, look, that's what they do. You don't go yell at them. Mm-hmm. So for a while, the argument was, and this is another argument for tariffs, that I'll sort of mention, and that has to do with probably what China would say, that they're a developing country, which is a little laughable, considering they are such an absolute massive economy. But at the beginning,
I mean, 30, 40 years ago, the picture was very different. So I think that's like where initially a lot of these arguments came from.
Yep. Yeah. When they first started in 2001, they had a stronger case, but that was over 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So another argument would be to protect industries, to protect local industries or nascent industries that are just starting up. And in
Hmm.
that sense, you could see why that would make sense. China, though, has a much stronger reason. And when I was working there, it was always very frustrating in that they basically did not allow any of the U.S. tech companies into the country. And you could do it under the guise or the argument being an economic one, saying, we want to give these uh, local industries or local companies a chance, and then they would just have these cookie cutter copies. So we would have the Google was Baidu,
Hmm.
Facebook was Renren, Twitter was Weibo, YouTube was Yo. It even sounded something similar. It was Yoku Tudou, and then they just didn't have any competition, and they could see what worked. They already figured out what the model was, and they built it up. There's sort of another reason though that China might want to do that, and that is for censorship reasons. You just don't want to try to deal with this from you don't want to try to do internet censorship through Google when you can just have a local industry, and you can apply as much pressure, I guess, as you want. I don't know really the details there, but let's just kind of go with that.
Well, yeah, certainly a domestic company would be easier to work with than a
You would
foreign
assume
company.
so, yeah. Not that I'm like in the business of this stuff, but I would assume it
Right.
would be easier.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, those are some more arguments for tariffs. Although those last two, be in the sense of like protecting nascent industries and for pure, I mean, totalitarian, I guess, government control. Let's say that is that's a much
Yeah,
stronger
that's
reason, and then
that's
reciprocity.
an
Just
interesting one.
the reason why Trump's doing this, and it's been totally clear, even just in those truths. I guess he posted that to Truth Social. It is a political consideration. It's not an economic one. So another source of sort of my frustration when I see the coverage of this stuff is them. They already have sort of like set pieces of arguments. These are the economic
Hmm.
arguments which you touched
Right.
upon as to why tariffs do not make sense. But
And they're
they're
all very standard arguments. They've been
very
around for a
standard,
very
right? We've
long
heard
time.
them. For me personally, again, like I said, I am biased towards free trade, but it's a political thing. And one of the things that Trump has said, and it was like a Wall Street Journal article that I read earlier, was he thinks the idea of using sanctions as a way to apply pressure is a bad one, because it's pushing people away from either using the U.S. as a reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, um, dollar diplomacy, if you like.
Hmm.
Um, and it's also pushing them towards using not even the reserve currency, but then also the different payment systems,
Right.
which I think is accurate. When
Hmm.
uh, you don't want to basically, right now the dollar is used as the reserve currency because it is well regarded.
Hmm.
And when you start saying, okay, we're no longer going to, supply you with dollars, or we're no going to complete these transactions because you're
Yeah.
using dollars, and they're going to find something else to use. I mean, obviously.
Right. And
So
that's very different from applying a tariff.
it's
If
very
you
different than
increase
applying a
the
tariff.
tariff a
Exactly.
couple percent, maybe each company's revenues go up and down a little bit. But if you completely slam the door, that's people have real incentives to move away from the dollar.
Yeah. I
Because
mean, the
just
thing with it,
tweaking it a little bit, no one's gonna. It's very difficult to change a reserve currency. You people or to invent a shared currency itself. Even you see the euro over the past 30 years now. There's been lots of issues along the way. Stability issues, monetary policy issues. It's just a really big undertaking. Something that just seems way out of scope for increasing tariffs a little bit. But yeah, if you say you just can't use our financial system, they'll have no choice.
yeah. And so tariffs, they don't care, theoretically what, financial system they come from or what bank they come from. They don't care what currency is being used, right? But they are still able to apply pressure, political
Right.
pressure, which is the goal here. I think he apparently too. Trump has a track record doing this. I mean, he was president before for 4 years, and apparently he sort of kicked off a renegotiation of NAFTA. I wish I knew.
Right.
I looked into this.
USMCA.
Yeah, and part of that was like, look, I'm just going to start, putting tariffs on all this stuff until we get you back to the table. I think it's a um, this is a political consideration. So economic arguments against it, um, to
Really might not
me,
even
kind
apply a
of
lot of the time.
they don't super resonate. No.
I mean, because I think like Trump himself is very open about this, saying like, I don't want to, or I don't need to impose tariffs. I just need to threaten using them.
Do you have do you have that truth up? I think I saw one of the truths, and he said like these tariffs are going to be there until you like stop importing drugs or something.
Yeah, he said. Oh yeah. All right. So the whole big thing was, as everyone is aware, thousands of people pouring through Mexico and Canada bring crime and drugs levels never seen before. Right now, people coming through the open border. On January 20th, as one of my
Hold
many
on,
first
Joe.
executive orders.
You're gonna have to try to do your best impression of Trump when you read this. I'm sorry, it just has to be. Just do your best. At least get the hand gestures.
On January 20th, as one of my
That's
first
it.
many executive orders, I will sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada 25% tariff, 25 folks, on all products,
It's the
all
best,
products
the
into
biggest.
the United States. The biggest
It's the
tariff, the
most.
best
It's the
tariff.
best tariffs. Right. Yeah. All right.
This tariff
That's pretty good.
will
That's pretty good. I'll give you an 8 out of
this
10 on that.
tariff will I'm getting into it now.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Have
no,
fun with this.
yeah, he finishes off saying, like you mentioned before, this tariff,
Fentanyl's coming into our country. It's killing America,
this tariff
slaughtering them.
will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular
Again, I
fentanyl,
need to practice it.
and
I think
all
we both need to
illegal
practice.
aliens stop this invasion into our country.
Yeah.
Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long simmering problem. We hereby demand that they use this power, and until such time as they do, it's time for them to pay a very big price.
Until such time as they do. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear that like, look, we'll let them go as soon as you solve this for us. It's a political pressure thing. It's
Right.
not an economic thing.
Mm-hmm.
But one other thing, and this is kind of the topic that I've been diving into, maybe for the next week's podcast, is that there's another argument for tariffs that I really never thought about. Maybe this has to do with my liberal training, and it was like intentionally kept from me. But Peter Thiel, when he was speaking to Barry Weiss, this was his main argument for tariffs, and it had to do with addressing the trade deficit. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, and the argument, and it was like, okay, trade deficits, I get it, but the way I thought that the way he laid it out, was quite compelling. So he basically said, yes, so I understand the theory of, competitive advantage. So every country could be like really good at this or that.
Mm-hmm.
I think just a little side note, I think competitive advantage is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, what you're not saying that like one country is just naturally better at it. I think the greatest argument for just kind of an open competition is that it's something similar to if you were like a football coach and you wanted to make the best team. Would you rather pull from a talent pool of 100 people or 10,000 people? And the answer is like, obviously you want to pull potentially from the 10,000. And that's what open borders is. You're able to, have access to the very best company. And I think,
but I think like in that argument itself, sorry not to cut you off, but like,
no, go ahead.
You wouldn't necessarily want to choose from the group of 10,000 people if you know something about the underlying. If you know that 98% of the people in the 100 person group are, the star athletes from wherever they come from, and the 10,000 is just completely random, your incidence rate of getting someone who from the smaller group is going to be far higher.
Yeah. Countries, though, I would say in general, or companies, I wouldn't say are set up like that. Can you think of an example? Like,
well, I mean, I would say just in general, I think that, globally in terms of innovation, and I don't have any numbers on this on hand, but innovation happens in America. there's very little groundbreaking technologies that have been invented in Europe, invented in China, invented in South America. I can't really think of any. The U.S. is really a center for innovation, and we attract students to come to American universities, and we really preach those things to students. And then they come here, they then create things here, and also we have a very supportive business environment for taking risks, borrowing capital with which to take risks, and you can't have innovation without taking large risks along the way. And so, not to get into the whole culture thing, but for example, this is a vast oversimplification, but in Europe, their general attitude towards taking large risks in a business venture, if it doesn't work out, it's a lot more negative than it is in the US. In the US, if you start a business and it fails, it's still pretty impressive that you started a business. I think that's kind of the general mindset. So I would argue in a lot of ways, the US is kind of producing a lot of these quote unquote best companies. But again, maybe I'm far
I mean, I would.
oversimplifying too much.
Well, yes. Unfortunately, we don't have the counterfactual, so we don't know what our life would be like if the U.S. had closed off. And it wasn't competing potentially with other countries. I guess there are a couple of counterpoints I would make. One would be, we do know that I think in the auto industry, it's a very good example of a counterpoint to that, in which they had put up a bunch of tariffs to essentially shield off, kind of help protect the local manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
But it sort of disincentivized, strong competition, for example. And, even though there were several of them, like, GM, Ford, Chevrolet, but they were not as good as the Japanese or the German cars. So it's like, the number, I mean, imagine how many, Japanese and German cars you see outside. It's not all American. So that's a counterpoint. Another one is a game I think that you and I are playing now. I think we're playing Helldivers. I don't think that's not an American game. I don't think. I think it's a Swedish one. I really think so. You might double check me on that. The other thing is, if you want to talk about a competition for what things are, I think Foxconn is another one. So that's you can get like Steve Jobs. He would get up there and just basically say Americans can't make stuff. That we have to go to Taiwan to get like our iPhones put together. So I mean, in that sector or any sort of white goods, we are being out. The competition's out of the board. You might be thinking about like a very narrow section of like tech companies, but imagine kind of what our lives would be like if we did not have access to these other countries.
Yeah, and that's the argument of stock of labor overall, which I totally get, and people have used for quite a while, and that's the efficient allocation of resources, et cetera. JD Vance had a good interview. I think it was ahead of the election. Even he was doing lots of interviews, and someone asked him the same question. They were trying to press him on this, like if you curtail immigration or increase tariffs, all these various ways of decreasing the stock of labor, that the U.S. is using, directly or indirectly, whether through free trade or through immigration in the country, like who's going to do these jobs? And he kind of just scoffed at her and said, Americans are going to do these jobs. Yeah. If you look at the numbers, so the unemployment rate can be kind of misleading sometimes because it only counts the people that are currently in the labor force. So separate from that is the labor participation rate, which is not, so those that choose to not be in the labor force, whether you're in school, you're elderly, or you're of prime working age and have just decided not to work, those people aren't counted. And that group of people has been growing for decades now in this country. And so one of his main arguments, and this is his background specifically, a lot of these towns in America where a lot of these jobs left, they just don't have the skills to get a new job somewhere else. The jobs just don't exist anymore. There's plenty of people in this country, maybe we'll have to find this interview clip, but his whole thing was there's plenty of people in this country. And in fact, it's going to be a net good for the American people. It's going to get people back to work, get them productive again. and obviously just from economic principles, but it gets people engaged again. It helps the community, all these different things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I sort of bristle at that, at the question, um, because it suggests that there's like Americans shouldn't or better than those jobs. And maybe that speaks a little bit to the reporter's biases, where she's coming from. I think it was a she, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think I might have seen the same thing. Um, and just the general thought around, these different tiered jobs and what's better and what's a
Hmm.
good job and what's not a quote unquote good job. I've heard
Hmm.
arguments like this before. One that I was thinking of was maybe this is a little too much of a tangent. I think Packman or something. This guy David Packman, he's one of the pundits, a kind of Democratic pundit. He was asking this question. I just disagreed with every single line of the question, every the way it was put together. It was like we have to pay for university because that's the only way to get a good job, and then that's the only way that you could advance for it. And it was just every line. I disagreed with him defining what is and is not a good job. I but that's just kind of the mentality from which I think they come from. It's not them to decide what is a good job. It's for you to decide
Right.
if this suits your skills, interests, time, whatever. Well, I'm from. Admittedly, I sort of grew up in Massachusetts. I went to university, masters, and I'm very much in kind of that realm. So I I think I understand that perspective. Unfortunately, I do not have the other one. But maybe there is an issue, just with regards to stigma isn't the right word, but the image of it. I think it, in the uh, sort of milieu that I come from, it's looked down upon when it really shouldn't. I do not
Right.
look down upon like anyone driving a truck or construction workers or anything like that. And I think it's a shame that people do, but definitely
Hmm.
people definitely do, unfortunately, but they
Yeah,
shouldn't.
and I think one of the
Um,
softer points, though, or maybe implicit to what Vance's argument is, so it's just like based off of his own background in the memoir that he wrote. One of the central points is that related to this, like people aren't growing up in defining what a good job is or isn't. They grow up and get a job at the factory like next door, and people do it for people used to do it for many years, for decades, multiple generations, and there is no question if this is a good job or a bad job. It's a job. I mean, I think many people thought it was a good job because they were getting paid, they're getting pensions. You don't get those anymore. It's a different story, but it led to a flourishing community. If you're living in a flourishing community and don't completely hate your job every day, I don't think people are thinking about that. I think maybe you and I are come from like a slightly different background where like you were saying, you went to university thinking very hard about what kind of careers we wanted. You were traveling, living and working in China, doing many different things, and we chose a very specialized field ultimately, and a ton of consideration into it. But for the millions of people in this country, that's just not their path in life.
yeah, so, somewhere along the line, you're right. I think we decided that your career is where you find purpose and meaning in life.
Hmm.
That is who you are. That is, what do you do is kind of the first question that you ask someone. And if
Right.
you're really being honest, it's so whatever the answer is, that's how you would judge them. Maybe okay, is this person above or below me? That's really what the question is. Um, I don't know when that happened, um,
Yeah, it seems
but it's
like
definitely
definitely for our
something,
entire
and it's
lives. It's
true. I mean, I can feel it. It's something
yeah,
sometimes that you have to like consciously get ahead of and on top of, and it's messed
right.
up. Um, that's a good point. Yeah, but the key of it is just that you're not defined by your career. You're defined arguably by everything else. Your family, your
Right.
hobbies, your interests, not the paycheck.
That's right.
So that's another good point. And it's just kind of the question that the reporter asked Vance, I think betrays kind of this alley that this route that we've gone maybe too far down. Um,
Not only too far down, but the way the question is asked is like there's no alternative than
Yeah,
that
it's like
view.
who would do this? Like, it's like, well, what do you mean? Uh,
Many people
because
would
it's
do this.
so beneath you. I mean, obviously, clearly
Right.
you wouldn't.
Yeah.
But it's like, and you would look, and the people who would do it are like invisible to you. Um,
Right. And
anyway, we're,
that's a very sad way of viewing people, viewing large, just groups
yeah,
of people throughout the country.
that's true. We gotta kind of put our finger on a big reason why, kind of a source of the divide, where our values are, how you judge other people. It's not Career should be quite low down the list. Not even a career, job. Um,
Right.
all right, Joe. Well, we touched upon some other
We
stuff, but those are.
covered a
I
lot of
think we're
ground
getting,
here.
yeah, we're getting off of tariffs, getting into some deep.
Yeah, maybe we
I don't know where we want to go, but like the case against, yeah, against tariffs for free trade, the inflationary pressure one you mentioned. Um, I don't know. The argument that's kind of a weak one in my view. Um, Only because I'm of the band of economists that I guess, excuse me, I guess I'm part of, or I agree with sort of the band of economists, the Milton Friedmans, who just say that inflation is everywhere all the time. I forget what the exact quote is, a monetary phenomenon. Um, so these are things that the Federal Reserve, who manages inflation, just needs to take into account. But
Mhm.
the arguments being like, oh no, all our prices are going to go up. Um, Yeah,
it's just
maybe,
way
but
too
then
blunt.
that's what the Fed is supposed to,
Mhm.
theoretically help to push them down.
And
Um,
also just the oversimplified observation that we already went through this 4 years ago, and there was no inflation for
right, and this is
20 years
not supposed to.
of
This is a
slavery.
threat. It's not real. It's not a real
Right.
threat. If look,
Well, they were done, or things were, tariffs were increased. Inflation didn't increase. And then the other funny thing is that, like, the Democrats were one of the ones that were criticizing that view during the previous elections and everything. And then Biden came into office and he kept all those tariffs, and he
oh,
even
that's
added
right.
a couple
Forgot
more.
about that. Right. Yeah. Um, it's hard to cut. The other argument that I'm sort of in favor of tariffs. It was like you said, even though it is a very small proportion of government revenue, it is something. I mean, at this point, I mean, if you've seen earlier episodes of this thing, you know that I just
We
the
could
government, yeah, the
we could
government,
use some extra millions to plug some
uh,
holes.
yeah, that's my single biggest issue is the government deficit, the budget deficit.
Well,
I mean,
I think we covered a lot of ground here.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can mention like so next week I can tell you what I'm working on, and it really just has to do with elaborating. I wanted to, uh, so I watched that interview. I would advise. It was a very good, interesting interview between Barry Weiss and Peter Thiel, just most recently on her the Free Press. And as I mentioned, Peter Thiel sort of walked through his arguments. And I remember listening to it and just kind of, he took a couple steps in there. I mean, he was describing um, balance of payments, trade deficits that I, I could follow him when he was speaking about it, but I always sort of had some questions. I never felt like I completely understood it. So I sort of dove into it and I looked at some of the numbers from this previous quarter to see exactly if this made sense. And I'm looking at it. I think it does. And although some of the lines I think are a little flimsy, or I shouldn't say flimsy, but I'm just like, okay,
Yeah, I mean,
it's a pretty broad view. Um,
I
but
think it
it's
sounds like it's a different view as well. Like
as
field of
most of his
economics,
views are. Yeah, that's why he's so interesting to listen to.
yeah, but also
Yeah,
just in econ overall, like the field's always changing. Since the, you know, post Great Depression, we've been very much in this Keynesian economic theory. Like every class I've had is based upon that, where you're just focusing on growth more or less, like spending to drive growth. Don't impose tariffs. You're going to have less trade. That's going to result in less growth. Don't do it.
Yeah.
That's the general underlying. Where Thiel is saying that's not the right thing to target, is what it sounds like a little bit.
Yeah. No, his no, what really got me questioning sort of my thought process around this had to do with his attack of the assumptions around like why
Right.
a free trade makes sense. And
Exactly.
he really undermined the assumptions. And he said that, well, it assumes that both parties have a similar system
Right.
of, their own regulations, of their own laws, all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And if those break down, then there's no reason to assume that, the chronic trade deficit, which I also did not like. And this is another, so, on another half of this, people will justify the trade deficit as saying, well, whatever trade deficit there is, that just means that the, US financial account means money is going in. But to give you a little sneak peek, what it really means is that the U.S. is collectively, like the U.S. citizens collectively, are incurring more foreign liabilities. So it's kind of saying they're funding. Yeah, they might invest it in the sense of like debt, but they're also like buying companies and they're also buying stock, and then they're also just holding on to the cash, which is fine. Um, but then you're kind of, if you think about it in those, in the sense of incurring just further liabilities and not as, oh, they're investing it into the US. Yeah,
Right.
you don't really like it as much. I don't like the word deficit. I don't like being in a deficit. And then I don't really like that. I
I don't like more liabilities.
don't like more liabilities either. So I don't know. So that
Very
got me kind
exciting.
of,
Pretty good sneak peek here.
it got me, yeah, it got me sort of again, it's not like I think about balance of payments very often. This isn't part of my job, but um,
But look,
it
it doesn't
definitely,
matter. Your job doesn't define you. You can think about
what I
balance of
mean
payments
is,
all you
yeah,
want.
I mean, what I'm saying is like, yes, I had to, brush off some of my old notes from grad school and stuff when I was like looking at this and when I was actually looking at the numbers. Um, anyway, so I think that'll be, if our audience has sort of a similar sort of knowledge level, basically like university, basic economics or something, that I think this will be interesting perspective.
Sounds good.
All
Looking
right.
forward to it.
Yeah. All right, man. Have a, have a good evening.
Thanks. You too. Good talking with you.
Yeah. All right.
You
Talk to
all
you next
out
week.
there, thanks for
Yeah.
tuning in again. Another episode of the Root of All Evil podcast.
I'm Luke.
I'm Joe. You
Yep.
stay classy, San Diego.
Yeah. Have a good night.
See ya.
All right. Bye.